We're here today with Bob Burnett, the CEO of Barefoot Mining, a huge Bitcoin mining evangelist and educator in the space. And we're here to talk about something really interesting, which is a thesis that you have been kind of tangentially talking about, this idea of the scarcity of Blockspace and how Blockspace will evolve over the course of the coming decades, the coming half century as Bitcoin really matures. So, Bob, first off, it's a massive pleasure to have you here. You've always been a good buddy in the space, and you've always been somebody who has really been executing and has just a vast repository of experience and knowledge and a great demeanor in the way that you present things. So, yeah, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Rob. Very kind of you to say those nice things about me. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's this issue that you talked about Blockspace, I think, is one that has some controversy around it. I'll say up front, not everybody agrees with me. Not everybody likes, what I have to say. Although in my mind, it's not about, liking or disliking. I think it's just about stating. I'm not necessarily trying to sell anybody on this, which would probably become more obvious, but I'm just saying I think this is the natural outcome. I think maybe a good place to start is, I think there's I'm from the mining world. You're kind of from the mining world. Maybe a lot of people listening are from the mining world. And I think when people think of miners or the mining function, I think they primarily are thinking about companies working for the block reward, like trying to get paid, right?
This idea that I set up a 10 megawatt mine, and the money that I make is what I get by calculating a hash price or what my FPPS or PPLNS reward is.
Correct. While that's not untrue, I think it will become less true with time. I think if we go forward in the future, like you talked about, whether this is 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, whatever the number is, I think it will become apparent that participating in this space is not about producing Bitcoin. In other words, making the block reward. Mm-hmm. It is about producing block space. And that a miner, a real miner, by the way, is somebody who is a commodity producer. Blockspace needs to be thought of as a commodity. And I think that's a pretty radical concept, probably a pretty big leap. In other words,
but to kind of orient everyone listening from the high level, the way that we think of a mining business, what you're saying is that there's two ways from the network side of things that miners are monetized. And we're monetized through the block reward, the Coinbase transaction. And of course, we know that that's getting cut in half every 4 years. So that's only going to become more and more painful. And then we have this other side of the equation, which is fees. And the fees that you pay when you submit your transaction to the mempool allow you to basically buy a ticket to get on the bus. And you get to kind of rank order typically based on how much you're willing to pay to get on the bus. But what you're saying is that the block itself, the amount of space that you get approximately every 10 minutes, that itself is a commodity.
That's correct.
Which is, it seems like you're early on this, right? Because if you look at blocks today, people might say, oh, well, the mempool isn't even full, which is why it's so exciting for us to kind of dive in and hear what you have to say about this.
Well, and I think it's paramount that we think about it now. We have to think about where we're going, not where we are, not where we've been, not where we are, where are we going. And so another way to say it is, a block is measured by weight units, right? So 4 million weight units is the maximum capacity of a block. So I think over time, instead of, hash price, we may think about more, how those weight units are monetized. And by the way, it's not just fees. We'll get to that maybe in a little bit. So, but you're right. And so in other words, let's just keep the math simple. There's roughly 150 blocks per day produced, right? Because we actually have a little faster than 10-minute block times, right? So it'd be 144 if we were at 10-minute block times, but we don't. We have like 9-minute and 45-second block times on average. We're producing on the order of 150 blocks a day. So if I have an operation, I have 1% of the global hash rate, and I'm creating the block template, by the way. Kind of probably get into that later. That means that I am the producer on average of 1.5 blocks a day. And I think I can think of that in the same context that a farmer in Iowa who plants a certain number of seeds on a certain area of land can project how much corn is how many bushels of corn he's going to have in the future. I can do the same thing as a miner. So that's, I think maybe that's the simplest way to think about this. Now, the other thing is, I think we have to think of Blockspace as an absolute. So we know Bitcoin is absolutely scarce, right? There's only going to be 21 million. Well, Blockspace is also absolutely scarce at any window of time. So if we look at 1 year as an example, we can mathematically calculate with a pretty tight tolerance that it's about 53,000 blocks a year. So we know that. So somebody that has 1% is that number again, because it's easy, right? Somebody that has 1% of global hash rate and and creates their own block templates is going to make about 530-ish of all the blocks in a year, right? So about 10 a week. Or a little more than one a day. So now within those blocks, and this is the part that I think gets a little difficult probably for some people to swallow, is we can only fit on average about 4,000 transactions in those blocks. So if you take the 3,000 blocks a year times 4,000 blocks, that's a little over 200 million transactions per year that we can accommodate at the base layer.
This is kind of the famous critique that, Bitcoin is slow because it only does 3 to 4 something transactions per second.
Yeah. Which I think we know is kind of a bullshit number because this is final settlement, all that. But what I find very interesting about that number is it is almost exactly the same capacity as Fedwire. So if we think about what's happening on a global basis within the banking system, about the same number of transactions are occurring. And that's just to kind of do all the bank-to-bank settlements that are occurring around the world on an annual basis. So now, if we fast forward some period of time, we could argue about what that period of time is. It doesn't, to a certain degree, it doesn't matter whether it's 5 years or 10 years. To a period where Bitcoin is now, at a minimum, a major player in global settlement, if not the player in global settlement. And I think it's fairly easy to see that it becomes very, very valuable in that context. And then if you think about, there's 330 million corporations in the world. There are 8 billion people in the world. Plus there's all this kind of backbone settlement and bank to banks. And we have to all share the 200 and some million transactions annually. And that's it. And that, by the way, in our case, that includes lightning channels opening and closing and splicing and all these sort of things also occurring to handle the payment layer that sits on top. There are a lot of people who worry about the future of security budgets and will there be enough money and blah, blah. I have zero concern about that.
Good,
because
me too.
The demand for this block space is going to be, I think, jaw-dropping. And it will have ramifications, though.
Yeah.
And maybe let me stop for a second, though.
Because this is interesting, because what you're painting a picture of is, I think back to when I was starting to get into Bitcoin, and there were all these memes about what would Bitcoin be like if we had X, Y, or Z. I remember people saying that, Lightning Network is a good idea, but it will never work. It's a myth. Maybe multi-signature stuff will work. The ETFs, I don't know. It's never going to happen. The Winklevoss twins got shut down. Let's give up the ghost. And we are really firmly in a place right now where a lot of the things that we thought were purely mimetic have become reality, have become expectation. And so what you're describing really interestingly is that we kind of live it as this expanding world of Bitcoin. And I think I saw it in an interesting way at the conference in Vegas last week, where, the demographics of the people there were profoundly different from the demographics that you would have seen had you gone to a conference like this, even 5 years ago. And that's just an indication of who is coming to Bitcoin. And so what you're making an argument of is, okay, let's start from the opposite end of the equation and look at the existing constraint of blocks and the existing transaction throughput that we have. Okay, let's assume no crazy hard fork or block size increase or decrease. But if we start with that, and then we look at the current world of transactions, which is how many transactions do you need to settle on Fedwire? How many transactions do you need to settle against this primary register while you have all this sort of secondary, more retail use cases in a lot of ways coming in? If I'm understanding you correctly, we're trying to envision the consequences, or what does the world look like if 10 years, 20 years, who knows? Every block over the course of a year is 100% full. We're envisioning a world where it's 100% full, And then what I'm curious to get your continued thoughts on are what does the world look like at this point? Who is using Bitcoin? How are they using Bitcoin? We're sort of starting from the end, which is all of the transaction space is taken. Not because there's a given fee rate, it's just taken.
Right.
Now let's figure out what the value of Blockspace as a commodity is. Yeah, paint that picture for us. What does the world look like?
Well, it's a world that I think what I'll, I guess, maybe call classic or old time Bitcoiners might not like. And I consider myself in that space. Like, the things I'm going to say aren't necessarily things that I particularly like. But if we think of, first of all, if Bitcoin is a major settlement layer or the settlement layer for the world, we will have virtually every major corporation and every financial institution and every nation state wanting to have access to Blockspace. That's one thing. The second thing is the real world does not work like Bitcoin. So Bitcoin, in other words, if I want to send you a Bitcoin right now, I am going to compete in real time for that space, right? And I can broadcast that transaction offering a certain fee rate. I can say I'm offering 12 sats per VByte, and I'm hoping a miner will pick it up. Or if I want, I can go to an accelerator and I can, pay somebody who has a marathon accelerator, right? I can pay to maybe have a higher level of certainty that I will get in. The real world does not operate that way. We cannot expect that banks and nations and corporations are going to deal with a real-time marketplace where they can't predict when they get access to block space and how much it costs. That's just because, let's just say a real example. Let's say I have a Bitcoin, I have a loan with a major financial institution. Okay. And I have to make a payment on the 31st of every month to that financial institution on that loan. Okay. I think it's a very simple real world case, right? Well, if I have to do that and 31st of every month as that day is approaching, I have no idea how full the mempool is that day. I have no idea what the fee will be. And let's say I'm trying to make a 1/10 of a Bitcoin payment. Well, if one month I'm paying 2 sats per VByte, and the next month I'm paying 100 sats per VByte, and maybe it doesn't even that doesn't settle, and I'm risking being late on a loan payment.
Sure.
Like, the world doesn't work that way, right? Because in the fiat system, if I'm going to pay a similar situation, right? I have a $10,000 payment every month, and I owe on the last day of the month, I owe this payment. I can say with 100% certainty what the cost and what the ability for that transaction to go through are. That's the power of the fiat system. So for us being Bitcoin, to have that same capability, we must provide, for us to become the global settlement layer, we must have the same capability or something very similar to it. Otherwise, it just won't happen.
What you're describing is really interesting because I think we've seen an analogous situation already happen in the mining industry. The trend that you're describing, this necessity for predictability and for stability, is sort of table stakes when it comes to running an organization of a certain size. You have to have regularity. The idea that you wouldn't be able to send all of your ACHs to pay your staff at a certain point in time at the end of the month or at the beginning of the month or every 15 days is absolutely unheard of. It's funny, we've seen a natural drive towards this with the explosion of FPPS pools, which we're now realizing have all these secondary sort of risk transfer issues associated with them. But I think the trend you're tapping into is totally apropos, which is that in the market, in the real world, and miners exist in the real world, they were begging for FPPS, even though it has these really nasty side effects in terms of risk transfer, in terms of centralization. And even though we know we won't, that you can have the argument about how sustainable they are in the long run. I think you and I are probably pretty similar in understanding that's not really something feasible. It's hard to build an FPPS pool off of predicting what your fees are going to be. But what you're describing is totally reasonable, should be non-contentious, that to run a large organization, you must have some kind of regularity in the way that you process and settle transactions.
Right. And so I'll give you another example. Let's say I'm an exchange. I'm River, I'm Swan, I'm somebody like that, right? So I want to do a major push in the fourth quarter of this year, October, November, December. I want to onboard 500,000 new clients. Okay. And so I'm going to spend $10 million in advertising to try to onboard these new people. And of course, companies like that, I'm going to promote self-custody.
Yeah.
Okay. So now to do that, I'm going to spend the $10 million in advertising, but I'm going to be promoting this self-custody. But if I try to do that in the current environment of Bitcoin, I don't know whether or not I actually will be able to fulfill my promise of self-custody because I don't, and what the cost of that will be. So if I'm going to offer free self-custody as part of this program, well, how much is that going to cost me? Is it going to cost me 1 sat per VByte or 30 sats per VByte? What dramatically changes the cost profile of my program? I cannot, in reality, I can't do this unless I know I have an arrangement by some mechanism to procure the block space ahead of time. So I could do that by using essentially an accelerator product. I could have a direct relationship with a miner. I'm working on a block space forward contract, or I could be a miner myself. Like all those are different ways for that to happen. But I'm gonna have to lock that in, and because I can't make a business plan without it. Another example that I think will be reality, if I were American Express right now, as an example, what I would be doing is I would be preparing a program for my corporate clients and my high net worth clients, the people that have black cards and, these premium cards. And I would say, hey, get this card. Maybe it's $650 a year. And when you get this card, you get all of these benefits. One of the benefits you get is free on-chain resolution of your Bitcoin. And you can buy Bitcoin with your American Express, and we'll move it to self-custody for you. I would be thinking of programs like this.
Yeah.
Where access to Bitcoin, but more importantly, access to the base layer is, as a financial services company, I want to block it off because as American Express, you know what I'm afraid of? I'm afraid of Fold. I'm afraid of these kind of companies, which by the way, probably will do the same frickin' thing. So, I think what we have to do is you have to think about a world in which we have somewhat hyper-Bitcoinized, or we have hyper-Bitcoinized, and then say, well, Bitcoin can't behave. It has to change in order for that to occur. And I know I've had some interaction with some people in the development community, and for the most part, they hate what I'm saying.
Why? Because
they see it as a centralization force. They see it as a lot of private mempools. They see a lot of, and they view it as a centralization force. And I can't 100% disagree with that. But what I can also say is we cannot fulfill the destiny of Bitcoin without solving the problem. We must solve that problem.
What are the mechanisms, or what are the, I suppose we've maybe seen kind of the V1s of this, right? And maybe the earliest V1 are out-of-band transactions. So I have a request for block space that I don't think will be fulfilled by distributing my preferred transaction to the broad set of queryable nodes. And so I go directly to a miner and I pay them, off book. And I say, hey, sneak this in. We know that's a thing that happens. We know it exists. So maybe that's V1. V2 is maybe you get something like a slipstream. You get something like a transaction accelerator, which is either Amara going and saying, hey, contact it through this platform and pay this different fee. And that's kind of a private mempool, right? A transaction accelerator, maybe you're just batching a number of pools that will participate in a program, and now somebody takes a little bit off the top and everybody kind of participates in this side program. What do you see happening at scale? Is this what happens at scale and people just do? Because the risk that people bring up with this is this idea of, if there are too many private mempools, if private mempools become a broad sweeping thing, so to speak, become broadly adopted in the market, you lose the pricing signal for transactions. You no longer know how much it costs to send a transaction. What do you see rolling out in this kind of universe?
Well, I don't think that's 100% true.
Okay. What happens?
Well, I think I agree with you on the V1 and the V2 thing, but let me tell you what I think V3 is.
Yeah, awesome.
Okay. So let's go back to the beginning. We said if block space is a commodity, okay, and I am a producer, I'm a miner, right? I'm a producer of block space. I'm sitting here in June. Well, if, by the way, subsidy has gone way down and now fees are my primary source, or at least a major source of my income stream, if there's high volatility in fees, I have an issue because
Mhm.
I don't know which block I'm going to win.
Yeah.
I know within Windows approximately how many blocks I'm going to win, but I don't know which block I'm going to win. And if I win the low fee blocks, but not the high fee blocks, even if I'm including everything, we'll take all the inscription ordinal stuff out. Let's pretend I'm picking everything I can. I still don't know which one I'm going to win, right?
Mhm.
And so that's a little scary. And as you said, miners have already migrated heavy to FPPS because of this consistency. Well, here's the way they get around it. We'll go back to the 1% example. If I, and I'm working on this with a company called Blockspaces, and we've made some announcements already about it, but if I am a miner and I have 1% of global hash,
Mhm.
I know I'm going to win 10 blocks a week, give or take. So I could go in a window like the first week of October, and I can say with very high certainty that I can offer one or two of those blocks at a fixed price right now. I go to the marketplace and I
And
say,
future
hey,
sell your block space.
I'm going to sell here in June. I'm going to offer 5 sats per VByte. I have no clue what the market will look like then, but I will sell access to 2 of them today, 20% of my expected number. On the other side, there may be a Swan, there may be a River, there may be Rob Warren, the individual who goes, well, hey, I want to do a UTXO consolidation. I want to run a marketing program. I have a loan payment due in that window. And I see this contract where I can go buy block space ahead of time at 5 sats per VByte. Okay. So that sounds good to me to know that I have somebody who's going to give me a guarantee that I can get access to the block space at a fixed price. I now can make reasonable business decisions. So now, by the way, now the market is getting price signals, not just in the moment, but it's getting
But
price
stretching into the
signals
future.
into the future. So
Yeah.
it's, in my opinion, it's an improvement because now if this gets even semi-widely adopted, we can look at the future and have an idea of where demand is the highest
Yeah.
and where pricing can be.
This is very interesting, right? Because it one thing that I don't think folks like to think about all the time, and I actually there's a piece I'm kind of noodling around right now that I want to write, which is this idea of like the ethics of Bitcoin mining, right? Like, do Bitcoin miners have to behave in the best interests of Bitcoin? And oh, look at that, I've got a thumbs up.
Yeah.
Do they have to behave in the best interests of Bitcoin? And the conclusion I keep coming to is no, they have to behave in the best interests of their business operation and their users. And so miners, you shouldn't expect that miners will be loyal to a certain kind of functionality, a certain kind of mempool deployment or use, that they won't do things like out-of-band transactions. You shouldn't even assume that a miner won't switch to mining BCH if it's more profitable than mining Bitcoin. And assuming they're orange-pilled, maybe they just use that hash and settle into Bitcoin. But you can't really apply the sort of cypherpunk standards of the ethos of the Bitcoin code to the world of mining, because the world of mining exists out here in the world of externalities. And so when it comes to financialization of Bitcoin, whether it's the idea of hash price, or what you're describing, which is block price or block space price or VByte price futures, that just seems like it seems like something that, while we may find maybe it's icky or I don't like it from certain perspectives, it seems entirely reasonable that this is the direction that things will go, because A, it's already been going that way, and B, it sounds like you're arguing, to fulfill the demands of hyper-Bitcoinization, large companies will demand certain kinds of assurances.
Correct. I agree with everything you said, but the caveat I'll throw is, I am a miner. I've got my fingers in a lot of places in the ecosystem. I still choose to operate with the mentality of do what's best for Bitcoin. And
Sure.
I've had a lot of internal thought and plus conversations with several people that I respect, and talked about things like the Blockspace forwards and said, well, hey, is this good for Bitcoin or is it not good for Bitcoin? And my belief is like, if we want Bitcoin to hyper Bitcoinize, this is the only way for it to happen. So if we want Bitcoin to remain as a $2 trillion asset and maybe have the world look at it 20 years from now like it looks at Monero today, then that's fine if that's somebody's vision of it. But that's what it will be if it can't make this leap into the mainstream. And these are the types of things that will be required of the mainstream. And I think the centralization forces, I mean, we have so many centralization forces, as you know, within the ecosystem, and we do have to push back against them when we can, but we can't do so to the point that we don't even go down certain paths. And I think
that's right.
This is in my mind close to existential to Bitcoin. Yeah. And I'll give another example, one other example that I've talked about somewhat. And that's that. Now think about it from the nation state level. If you are a country, Rob, you're the prime minister of Algeria or whatever, pick a
Brilliant.
country, right? Well, if I were advising you, what I would be saying to you right now, Rob, is I would say, hey, I know you've heard all about strategic Bitcoin reserves, countries all over the world talking about it, thinking about it. But I would say you're missing the main theme. The sovereignty and destiny of your country is much more determined by your control over Blockspace than it is by how much Bitcoin you have. So if I was Algeria, I would say, hey, I want to have a relatively small country, right? I would say, hey, I want to have 1/10 of 1% of the world's blocks produced by me. I want to control the template creation of those. Now, that could be me owning the hash rate. It could be me having the Algeria pool and saying, hey, attract mining companies, but say they have to use the pool. Now, I know this gives people the willies, but what I would say is if Algeria does that, they have just made themselves immune to economic sanctions and economic attacks by the rest of the world.
Because no matter what, they can send when they...
Yes, they have a mechanism by which they can always transact. They have 1/10 of 1% gives them a block a week. They got 4,000 transactions a week that they can buy wheat and sell oil and do whatever they have to do the country's business. And the bigger the country, the more the hash rate they should have.
I'm already envisioning a world of Blockspace alliances.
Absolutely. I think regionally and, different, different blocks, no pun intended, of countries forming to do this sort of thing. Again, I'm just saying what I think is going to happen. So this is interesting. So what I'm saying is, if we kind of draw it together, is I think if we pick a time 10 years or 20 years from now, the big miners of the world are going to be nation states and financial institutions.
Well, that is spicy. I could see how you would immediately get folks a little bit riled up with that one.
And now I think that, you know how I feel. They will be the elephants, my animal analogy, like that they will be the elephants, not so much Riot and Marathon kind of companies, but more those kind of companies. By the way, as an example, Bank of America's IT budget in 2024 was about $11 billion.
Wow.
So for them to say, hey, they want to place in mining, not a big stretch, not a big commitment for them to be involved. These organizations are not going to be motivated by the block reward. They won't care about the subsidy or the fees at all.
Wow.
What they're going to care about
Simple
is
access.
The importance of the transactions, taking care of their clients, taking care of their country. Those will be the reason that they mine. And so they're probably, in other words, if they have obligations to their clients or to their country, there's no amount of money that will allow others to get into their blocks. Now, obviously, if they have room, they will now probably start behaving like normal miners. but we don't know how much of that there will be.
We say, as we said very early on, and we're kind of coming to the end of our time together, but as we said early on, this idea that the security budget is a bit of a non-issue. It's a bit of a distraction from what I think how we conceptualize the future reality of mining. And I've always come at it from the perspective of, if you can start to understand the way that an individual monetizes a business, which is not strictly based on the commodity they produce. It's not so simple to say that Bitcoin miners merely produce hashes in exchange for electricity, because that model changes radically when you start to look at the multi-billion-dollar company that has MIT graduates that are their CFOs who can do all sorts of magical things on the spreadsheets. And then when you take it to the small level and you look at the world of lottery mining or the rabbits and the heating element side of things,
Yep. That's a different dynamic.
All these kinds of miners are just fundamentally creating different kinds of businesses that cannot be easily understood in the idea of keep hash price above your cost of operation. And what you're describing is this really beautiful extension onto that, which is the interface between the financial rails of the world and Bitcoin is the block. It is the block space. And mining is the function that allows that to occur. It is really kind of the oil that keeps the machine going. And so fully expect every multi-billion, cent-to-billion, multi-trillion-dollar company in the world to have a very vested interest in Bitcoin mining for the purposes of block space when hyperbitcoinization comes, which I think is just such a beautiful extension of thought that can only come from somebody like yourself who understands the way not just mining works, but also the way that big business works, the way that people settle when they're operating at this scale.
Yeah, in other words, the economic incentives blur. I would say this, they are all working toward economic incentive. Mm-hmm. Right? They are working in the best interest. But American Express will measure it based on how many customers they have. A nation state like Albania is going to look at it based on, almost like national defense, like national security. And even, the other day, there was an interesting transaction. It may have even been yesterday, where Tether moved 14,000 Bitcoin into 21, the new Jack Mallers organization, right? And it was cool because it was like $1 billion something of Bitcoin that moved for like, I don't know, $1.50, right?
Love it.
Fees. But who is privately a very, very large miner? Tether, right? I mean, that's public. Not how big they are, but we all know they are very large. Do you think they are doing that just because they want to make Bitcoin? Or maybe they have another motive. And maybe they understand that control of block space is paramount to the type of company they want to have. And because if in the future they need to move 14,000 Bitcoin to somebody else, they don't want to depend on somebody else to include their transaction in a block. They may go, well, hey, I'm gonna get it in a block that I make. I don't care.
This has been such a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you for joining me and for talking about this, really gaming out from kind of the first principles, this concept of valuable block space and who's going to use it. Because I think these to me are the most interesting conversations to have, is to say, what's happening now, but what does hyper-Bitcoinization really look like? Because nobody wants to be disappointed or feel that, oh, you lost the plot. Everybody's seen the screaming on Twitter when somebody goes, oh, Bitcoin is captured, and we have all the famous rage quits from history. So thank you for taking the time and for sharing it with us. And I hope we'll be able to get you out to future events and whatnot, get you on the stage, get you presenting, and keep hearing your perspectives, because they're always so valuable.
Well, thank you. Always a pleasure to chat with you, Rob. Thank you.
Yeah. Now tell us, before we jump off though, where can people find you, and what should we keep an eye on for you in the next couple of weeks or months?
Find me on Twitter, boomer_BTC. Those of you watching, I have a show where I occasionally rant called Old Man Yells. Find that on YouTube and Spotify. And, barefootmining.com if you want to learn about our mining. We're pretty much in a perpetual mode of creating joint ventures where we love bringing in like-minded investors, ethocentric investors, to help build new sites. And so we're actually in the midst of doing one right now. We're doing a stranded natural gas site in Pennsylvania, and we're actively raising for that. So
amazing. Well, all the success to you, Bob, and thank you.
Thank you, Rob.